9.02, which will begin our discussion of policies, and I would like to turn this over to Ms. Minson, please.
Good evening. We have two policies for second reading this evening. The first is policy BCD, closed meetings. This is the policy that would replace current bylaw 2.26 on closed meetings. Based on what's posted on the board, on board docs right now, there would be no changes from first reading, except I noticed there's no period following paragraph A on line 5 on page 1, and no paragraph following paragraph B at page 86 on page 3. So I can make those changes. Any questions, comments, concerns with policy BCD, closed meetings?
Mr. Reitinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mentioned to Ms. Minson just before the meeting, I didn't have a chance to go through and read these policies until today, and I was not present for the first reading of this policy. I have a suggestion to shorten this policy, which I am not hard over on, but it just seems to me that most of this policy, the numbered paragraphs under A, are nothing but a cut and paste from a statute. And a statute that changes not infrequently. And I simply wonder whether all of those numbered paragraphs through item 15 could be deleted, and instead A1 could say something along the lines of closed meetings may be held by the school board or any committee thereof only in accordance with Virginia law, comma, as specified in, and then a cross-reference to the statute, rather than repeating all of this. I can see some value in including this because it means that people don't need to go to look at the statute, but the statute is publicly available, and it feels like a lot of language that really isn't all that necessary and frankly isn't of much interest to most people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reitinger. Are there is any feedback on that idea? It's not, I don't know how formal yet we are, but is there any feedback on that concept? Ms. Russell?
I think that it makes sense, just, assuming what Phil's saying is correct in terms of the frequency of the changes, it would cut down on needing to do frequent revisions to our policy if we were just to reference whatever is currently on the code.
And the Virginia Code section that would be referenced is the one that's on page 3 at line 106, 2.2, 3711. And after you raised this, Mr. Reitinger, I went back and looked at that code section, and the language from today is slightly different than what's included in the VSBA model policy. So that would support kind of your approach to this. I do know that one of our current policies on teacher grievances specifically says that the school board will follow the teacher grievance process as outlined in Virginia Code, and then references to the Virginia Administrative Code there. So that would be consistent with what we've done in other types of time. At the same time, the VSBA, when we subscribe to their policy services, they do update all the policies. So if this policy were updated in the future, we would just make sure that we follow the VSBA model update. So I think it's really 6 of one, half dozen of another, and whatever the board's preference is there.
Ms. Minson, I guess just a procedural question. If we were to, if there were a motion made along those lines and we were to adopt it, then would we need to sort of cancel, not complete second reading, but have a second reading at our next meeting in February, or could we take some other course?
We could go forward with the motion, policy BCD, closed meetings as amended. And I would just need to make sure that I'm clear on what you want the language to be starting at line 6. Or we could we could move this to third reading, and I could present a cleaned up version of it at the meeting in February if everyone wants to lay eyes on another time. That's not atypical, and that's not a problem for me to do. So then just from the dais, the motion would just be for the second reading and adoption, approve second reading of BCD, and then second reading and adoption, assuming you all are okay with policy BCDA.
Mr. Reitinger, do you have a suggestion for this or a preference for this?
Just to save time, I think the proposal is relatively straightforward, so I would suggest that it simply say that the change be in line 6, in accordance with Virginia law, and then a cross-reference to the specific section, and then a period, and then remove all of the numbered subparagraphs. And I think it's fairly simple and straightforward to do that without going to third reading.
So we would keep it, closed meetings may be held by the school board or any committee thereof only in accordance with Virginia law, comma, specifically Virginia Code 2.2, 3711,
Yes.
period. Great. Does that sound amenable to the rest of the board?
Any other comments on this? Okay, so we'll make the appropriate motions after we've had the discussion for BDCA then.
Okay, and then lines B, C, and D, starting on page 3, would remain the same. So it's just getting rid of paragraphs numbered 1 through 15.
15, yes.
Great. All right, moving on to the next policy for second reading, BCDA. This is calling and certification of closed meetings. It very closely aligns with FCCPS bylaw 2.27. There was one proposed change from first reading, which changing the language back to no closed meetings shall be held rather than are held by. Any questions about policy BDCA?
Any questions? Not seeing any. Okay. Then I would entertain a motion with the appropriate amendment from what is online. Mr. Reitinger.
I'll give it a shot. I move that the school board approve second reading and adoption of the following policies. Policy BCD, closed meetings, as amended, and policy BDCA, calling and certification of closed meetings.
Thank you, Mr. Reitinger. Is there a second? Second. Mr. Webb, thank you. Ms. Goodell, do we need to do a roll call vote, or can we just do? Unanimous. All right, then, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any abstentions or objections? Okay. Thank you. Moving on to 9.03, which, again, I will turn to Ms. Minson.
Thank you. This is slightly different than what we usually do. Policy FEA had been previously adopted by the board on June 12th, 2018. There were changes to the House Bill 1725, proposed changes that are now reflected in the Virginia Code at 22.1-138C, which is shown on this policy at lines 23 to 26, saying that in the educational facility specifications, school boards will consult with local building officials and state or local fire marshals to make sure that all security enhancements to public school buildings are compliance with uniform statewide building code and statewide fire prevention codes. I've proposed, if the board is amenable to it, waiving first reading, since this is just a change to make sure that we're compliant with the Virginia Code. It's something that we already do. It won't change our practices, but amending the policy by waiving first reading and going to second reading and adoption by adding this language would allow us to be consistent with the Virginia Code. Any questions on policy FEA or the proposal to waive first reading?
Any comments or questions? Seeing no comments or questions, then I would entertain a motion on this one. Mr. Webb?
Mr. Chair, I move that the school board move to waive second reading and adopt policy FEA as presented.
Thank you, Mr. Webb. Is there a second? Second. Thank you, Ms. Litton. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Any abstentions or opposition? All right, seeing none, motion carries. Moving on to 9.04, adoption of first reading of policies. And again, Ms. Minson.
Great. We have two policies for first reading this evening. The first is policy BDA, regular school board meetings. This would replace FCCPS bylaw 2.23. 2.23 had previously covered both regular school board meetings and electronic participation in meetings from remote locations. The remote locations portion was already covered in the board's adoption of BDD on December 11th, 2018. So adopting regular school board meetings, BDA would allow us to completely get rid of bylaw 2.23. In comparing BDA to bylaw 2.23, the language is substantially similar in virtually every way to what the bylaw says. So this would not change any of our practices. And I don't propose any changes to the VSBA model policy, BDA. Any questions on this policy?
Not seeing any.
All
Thanks.
right. So the last policy for tonight is policy BDDH, public participation at school board meetings. You will note that I have made a few proposed changes to this policy. Some of the strike-throughs show that instead of saying chairman and him, it is a neutral and talking about the speaker rather than the gendered person who is addressing the school board. One thing that the VSBA has been doing recently in its policy adoption, and I've spoken with Elizabeth Ewing at the VSBA about this, is if something is not expressly required by the Virginia Code, they're removing it from policy and allowing it to be part of regulation. While I understand that practice, I think it's challenging here because the language that the school board proposed is that the school board adopt this policy and then adopt a regulation that talks about the length of community participation in school board meetings. And we've tried to keep the regulation process something that the superintendent proposes, adopts, and puts forward so that if there need to be necessary changes over time, the superintendent can make quicker changes to regulations, and that policy is in the province of the board. Our current policy 2.30, which would be replaced by BDDH, explicitly states that each speaker's presentation is limited to 3 minutes. So I proposed adding that at line 24 here. And our current policy also asks that the speaker state their name, address, and the subject of their remarks. I think that makes it clear to the board who's presenting and what they're presenting on, whether it is that they're a citizen of Falls Church City, or they're a teacher, or they have another connection to the school division. So I did bring that over, but otherwise, BDDH, besides those changes that I've pointed out and that are reflected in the red line version here, is quite similar to our current bylaw 2.30. Any questions about BDDH?
I'm not seeing any, but I actually did have two questions on this one, and I think one of them is in the stretch between lines 14 and 18.
Yes.
It's just because of the changes in the strike-throughs, all of which I agree completely with, but the sentence that ends with "the speaker shall address the chair," the next sentence now says, "At the conclusion of the speaker's remarks, any member of the school board desires further information, the member will address the speaker." There should.
It's missing it.
There's something missing in there, and that's all, just if that
Yeah,
one
At
gets
the
fixed.
conclusion of the speaker's remarks, if any member of the school board desires future information, the member addresses the speaker. Okay, I will add that in.
Okay. The more substantive question really is that limitation of 3 minutes. Is that something that we really, I don't know, I'm sort of asking fellow members, but also, is it wise to have that in the policy? Because if for whatever reason the chair were to decide it was 2 minutes because we've got 50 people in the room, or, somebody needed 1 extra minute, or for whatever reason the board wanted to extend it in a given circumstance, we'd be, I guess we'd have to have a specific action to waive that policy that day. So I just don't know what people think about whether we want to put the limit in there or whether we want to not, so, knowing that it is in the current policy. Ms. Linton?
I actually think it's good to have the limit in there so that when folks go to our policies, they see that we're enforcing the policy, and then if we need to, we can waive it. Otherwise, I think people may feel that we are controlling, how much, if it's an issue we disagree with, maybe we would be giving them less time versus we can refer to, it's clearly in the policy unless we state a clear reason not to do it that way. So I actually would support keeping it in there.
Mr. Webb?
I would support that as well. And I think what we've done in the past, I know I have, is when folks are giving their presentation within that 3 minutes, that you do we have been somewhat flexible to give an extra 30-second or minute here and there for folks to kind of finish up their thoughts, and that, but we do, at a point we will kind of have to rein it back, but I do think it's good to have it in there that says 3 minutes, but I think it's to the discretion of the chair potentially to give an extra 30 seconds or something like that to finish up a thought.
Thank you to both of you. Any other thoughts on this, Mr. Redding?
So just one thing to think about. I agree with both Ms. Litton and